Welcome to the CEC Report. It's January 20th and I'm Robert Barwick. And I'm joined again by CEC founder and leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
In today's CEC Report, we're going to discuss how the financial collapse isn't coming, World Bank. It's already here. We have an update on the MurrayDarling Basin fight, which focuses on how Prince Philip is currently running the same genocide attack on starving Mexicans. And finally, ecosystems are a genocidal fraud. So first, the financial crisis isn't coming, World Bank. It's already here. This week, the World Bank made a lot of investors around the world wet their pants because they issued a very dramatic and, in that sense, honest report on what they said is an impending financial crisis that's going to draw in the entire world. Now, before we talk about the factual details and what they've said, you have to point out the fallacy, which is that the crisis that began in July 2007, which Lyndon LaRouche called at that time, and you can see that on our website, and really erupted in September 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, it never went away. We're still in that same crisis. It's deeper and worse.
Exactly.
By saying that it's a new crisis, the World Bank wants people to believe that the other one was solved. And of course, that's far from the truth. Now, I just want to quote the Sydney Morning Herald's January 18 report on what the World Bank is saying. Quote, although contained for the moment, there is a risk of a much broader freezing up of capital markets and a global crisis similar in magnitude to the Lehman crisis. In the event of such a crisis, activity is unlikely to bounce back as quickly as it did in 08-09, in part because high-income countries will not have the fiscal resources to launch as strong a counter-cyclical policy response or to offer the same level of support to troubled financial institutions. And the Sydney Morning Herald went on to say, responding to the report, Acting Treasurer Bill Shorten said there was no doubt Australia faced, quote, a tough year ahead. So the bank, though, in what I've just read, gives it away. They're actually conceding the point that we've just made.
They have made for many years.
Exactly, which that the crisis isn't over. Yeah. Because by saying that the countries don't have the financial resources to bounce back, why not? Because they bankrupted themselves by the bailout, right? We've had the only policy that was implemented to deal with this crisis is 4 years of bailout of the bankrupt financial institutions. Now it's the countries that are bankrupt, and the World Bank is conceding that. So the next round of this, coming out of what's happening in Europe especially, is no country is adequately equipped to deal with. Now, also on January 18, Craig, Lyndon LaRouche delivered what he called the State of the Union address in the United States. And among everything he said, he emphasised most of all the very important need for a credit system. Now, I'm always asking you to talk about this, but let's do it again. But I want, just from the standpoint, isn't what LaRouche talking about a credit system the only way to deal with the physical dimension of this economic crisis?
There is no way out of it, Robbie, but let me just step back one step, because in a sense you're talking about these high-income countries will not have the fiscal resources to launch a strong counter. That's Australia. I mean, look at us. We have an enormous amount of debt that's built up to the fact that there was even press releases this last week, I think from, was it Andrew Robb, put out press releases talking about the fact that, the debt, the government debt has increased by 250%. Now, we've already talked about many times how the public and private debt is 1 trillion, but that's growing very, very rapidly, and of which large proportions of this debt actually has to be turned over. But what's also stunning is when you realise the detonator of this particular debt crisis, because of the enormous amount of debt built up in the system, is a result of the monetarist and financial policies of the world, this current monetarist system. What you're seeing is, in Technicolor, how these hedge funds, these parasitical financial institutions are making a killing off the backs, literally, of the sweat and blood of the people, say, for example, in Greece. Now, the hedge funds, these third parties, they sit on what we call cheap bonds. Now, these cheap bonds mean that they have very high interest rates, and therefore the government of Greece has to pay the high interest rates, which makes them very easy to sell. So as far as a hedge fund is concerned, they're very cheap. However, if there's a default action and the country says, well, we can't pay these bonds, these very same hedge funds have covered themselves with these so-called derivative policies.
Credit default swaps.
Credit default swaps, which means they're, in a sense, insured. So on the one hand, they're ripping the lifeblood out of the Greek people by the Greek government having to pay through austerity measures, reducing the money paid to public servants, welfare and so forth, to these hedge funds. And on the other side, if they default, the hedge funds clean up. Now, this is the result. This is the characteristic of this parasitical debt structure of the world's monetary and financial system. So the only solution is to completely say this system is bankrupt, which it is, and go with a new system. And the only way that you can do that is make a political decision, like Franklin Roosevelt did back in 1933, and go with what was called a Glass-Steagall. He made a political decision. He's saying, we are not going to have the speculation in the system. We are not going to have banks, merchant banks, dictating to the American people policy based upon their welfare and their physical economic living standards, things like housing and so forth. So therefore, we are going to quarantine. We're going to create a dividing line. And therefore, the real banks, the commercial banks, they will be supported. They'll be supported and they'll continue the operation. These other banks, well, they can stop using depositors' funds in order to be able to speculate with them.
Because, of course, real banking provides a service to activity that is physical.
Yes.
It's trading, it's small business,
providing money for factories, it's providing money for farming, for housing, that sort of thing. It is not providing money so that hedge funds can then buy cheap bonds in Greece and rip the lifeblood out of the people of Greece.
Because what the hedge funds do is purely monetary. There's no physical component to it. They're given a license to play Monopoly.
The only physical component of a hedge fund is a computer sits on their desk. That's all it is. There's nothing there. It's just playing with money and giving money intrinsic value. So with a credit system where the government takes control of the creation of credit through national banking as opposed to the central banking debt structures, what you decide is that we are going to create credit on the assets of the nation in order to provide for the physical well-being of our people through the development of infrastructure and so forth. And you say, and there has to be, in a sense, a wiping out of all the existing paper debt. And that's what Mr. LaRouche has called for. If we don't have that, look, the system is finished now. We've said this for many, many years. As soon as the derivatives bubble was launched, this was the actual end of the system. Because you're literally, as in Greece, sucking the lifeblood out of the people. And this, of course, this is the flip side of the whole genocidal green movement, this economic policy of free trade and British, free trade and globalisation. It's all one policy. And we've written a lot about this in our New Citizens. Last couple of New Citizens in particular go through the British system of monetarism, how it's part of an empire. So in terms of a specific credit system, it's the government, nation states taking control of their financial system, creating the credit through national banking, not central banking, and then with large-scale infrastructure development projects, funding the future development of those assets and not simply creating debt.
Because, of course, ultimately, we're not trying to fix up the financial system per se. We're trying to fix up the physical economy, and the financial system that services that will be fine.
Yeah. All we have to worry about is the emission of credit in the economy, and money has to be emitted by governments centrally, through treasury facilities in order to meet that credit. Everything else, all the speculation that's built up in the last 40 years, it goes. We don't need derivatives and credit default swaps, interest rate swaps, and all these so-called insurance policy. That's a monetarist policy of the empire. We have to destroy it.
So, Bill Shorten, if you're watching that, that's what you need to do. When we come back, we're going to discuss an update on the MurrayDarling Basin and how Prince Philip is running the same operation in Mexico. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So, we have an update on the MurrayDarling Basin, but what we're going to report is how Prince Philip is currently running exactly the same attack, but on Mexico, which is currently starving. In Mexico at the moment, Prince Philip's SS thugs, the World Wildlife Fund, are doing making demands on the Mexican government to lock up water basins of Mexican rivers from any future development.
Just like the Murray-Darling Basin.
Just like the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, here's the backdrop to it. Mexico right now is in a terrible drought. It's a very bad drought. 20 million Mexicans are currently living in food poverty, i.e. they face starvation. In the region of Chihuahua, the Indians are already starving. That's the situation in Mexico right now. So it's in the face of this that the World Wildlife Fund has moved to make the Mexican Water Authority lock up water basins across Mexico as ecological water reserves under a new paradigm of national water management proclaimed as reclaiming water from human use for the environment. Sounds incredibly familiar. It's exactly the same thing. Now, in practice, the WWF and the Mexican Water Authority Water Reserve Agreement, which they signed last December the 15th, they're saying this is a global model. Good on them. Because it's in tandem with what they're doing here in the Murray-Darling Basin. And it aims to prohibit any new water projects under the pretext of protecting a so-called natural water cycle. Now, there are two projects that we've talked about on the CEC report in the past, but which Lyndon LaRouche in particular is leading the push for, which would solve Mexico's water problems. One is NWAPA,
yes,
the North American Water and Power Alliance, and the second is known as PLENO. In English, it's the Northwest Hydraulic Plan, which would take water from regions of Mexico where it's plentiful and take it to these areas that get drought affected. This WWF scheme in Mexico is calculated to kill the potential for those plans off so that they can't happen, and of course deny Mexico that avenue to solve its food problem. So that's what the WWF is doing in Mexico. Back in Australia, of course, this week, a front for the World Wildlife Fund, the Wentworth group of quack scientists, I mean, did I say quack? I'm concerned.
Don't defame ducks, Robbie.
Don't defame ducks. They've announced very boldly that they do not support, Craig, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority draft plan.
Of course
Why?
not.
Because it doesn't cut enough water, right? Incidentally, by the way, the Wentworth group has a new member, Professor David Caroli, who is kind of famous among scientific circles. He's the big climate change guru out of Melbourne University. But this line they're pulling, of course, we'll talk about a certain nuance of it, but what I wanted to get you to comment on, Craig, what they're doing in Mexico is while Mexico's starving. Mm-hmm. Here Australians, we're trying to see the full import of what's being done to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. If Australians were starving now, like Mexicans are starving, do you think they'd see the Murray-Darling Basin plan for what it is?
Well, I think when you get to the point of starvation, things change in a great revolution. And I think, when the cities start to starve because there's not enough food, that's when you really get into problems. But it's a situation you don't want to get into, Robbie, because look, the point is the destruction of the Murray-Darling Basin and our food growers is the destruction of 100 years of development. You can't put that together quickly. You've got multi-generations of farmers in those areas, highly skilled farmers that are going to be basically snuffed out because of a decision by a radical green group, radical green policy, I should say, in order to do so-called protect the environment. Now, this is a complete fraud that we've talked about. It's run top-down, as you mentioned, by Prince Philip. Now, we've documented this in our last New Citizen in spades. It was Prince Philip who personally established the World Wildlife Fund, personally established the Australian Conservation Foundation, personally established the International Union for Conservation of Nature, personally helped develop the Ramsar Agreement, which is shutting down these basins. And the intention, as we've said many times on this show and in other forums, is population reduction, full stop. They don't care if they kill Mexicans. Who are Mexicans anyway to these people? They're just, like ants to be squashed. That's the mentality that these oligarchs like Prince Philip have.
Well, of course, in case Australians buy into that mentality about Mexicans, They need to realise that the oligarchy
same
thinks
idea
exactly
here.
the same way about Australians.
In fact, they have a disdain for Australians. They have, we're just plebs too. We've always been looked like that. We're just, just tools of the empire. And we have,
or as Churchill said, we're of bad stock.
Bad stock, which is a polite way of putting it. Actually, what he really think. He couldn't say what he really thought. But I mean, in terms of the population reduction, remember, how are you going to get a reduction of 7 billion down to 1 billion people, which is what Prince Philip has endorsed? Well, there's two ways of doing it. One is by literally shutting off food supply, cutting out the necessities of water for food production. The second, of course, is thermonuclear war, which we've talked about in the past programs, which is also run top-down by the British through their various assets. And we see this debacle at the present time over Iran as the fuse, potentially, of a third World War, thermonuclear war. So look, everything that's driving this in Australia, which is what people really have to get to understand, is that we're not exaggerating. We're not being extreme or radical by saying the intention is population reduction.
Well, if we had Australians starving and everyone knew that and it was a national crisis, and Australians heard that farmers who could grow food are being told they're not allowed to use the water to grow food, Australians would be up in arms. Well, they've got to understand is that's exactly what the same crowd is doing in Mexico right now.
When you say up in arms, Robbie, the Howard government took the arms away.
Oh, yeah.
They don't have any. I mean, there's enough firearms around, but we don't want to get into a shooting war on this. This is a political battle. That's why we in the CEC have been so passionately fighting in it. We don't want to get to that sort of, because you've basically lost it, then you've lost the fight. The point, though, is that people can do this by joining the CEC, joining and actually understanding where we're coming from in terms of fighting these principles of what we call oligarchism, or the oligarchical principle. What Prince Philip represents is this principle whereby he says that there is an elite that have the right to have the power to control the masses. They're like the gods of Olympus. And they'll treat the masses like basically like human cattle, because they deny that all human beings are endowed with this spark of creativity, that we're fundamentally different than animals. We're not animals. We have the power to make discoveries of the principles of how this universe works. And therefore we can transform the environment, like through water projects, through dams, through the development of things like concrete, steel reinforcement, earth moving equipment, to transform physically the environment around us to create the water necessary to produce copious amounts of food. And what you see in Mexico with the starvation of the Indian populations there and the Mexicans themselves, it's the same thing that's happening in the Horn of Africa right now. This is a depopulation policy that's being pushed specifically by the British Empire through the agency of the likes of Prince Philip personally.
Yep. All right, and in the past, Craig, oligarchies, in order to maintain this power, have used the priesthood to get people to believe in myths.
Yes.
And it's the myths that they believed in allowed them to be ruled over. Well, so when we come back, we're going to discuss the fundamental myth that people believe in today that gives green fascism its power. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So finally, let's discuss ecosystems are a genocidal fraud. This week, the CEC is launching a major counterattack on green fascism because we are releasing our new DVD, which is entitled The Plot to Destroy the Murray-Darling Food Bowl, Ecosystems are a Genocidal Fraud. Now this DVD features a review of the Adam Curtis documentary which was made for the BBC in London entitled All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace.
And Robbie, I mean, I've seen a preview of this, and I know that you're the Director of Research for the CEC. This is a major intervention in the fundamental axioms of what the Green Movement is. And if people get to watch this DVD, which they absolutely should, it'll be available on our website, it'll be available in hard copy in the next week or so, as people are watching this show. It really does give people a sense of just how they're being duped. But as a Director of Research, rather than hearing it from me, you've been on top of all the research, the team of people have been working on this. So why don't you elaborate a little bit for the audience out there what we're actually doing here, give them a sense of the power.
Well, and should I tell them that they'll see my face a little bit on the DVD?
Well, they will. But
we should warn them about that.
Robbie,
okay.
They're used to it now on this program. So.
Well, here's the important point. Last year we launched a major offensive, which this is actually a continuation
Which
of.
is the New Citizen newspaper.
In our New Citizen.
Yeah.
And there's three things in there that were bombshells. One is our article from Anne Lawler's speech at our conference on the humbuggery of Darwin, Charles Darwin, how Darwin's natural selection is outright garbage. One is on how the second law of thermodynamics is a fraud.
Which has caused a lot of controversy since, particularly amongst the physics department of universities.
Yeah, that's been distributed throughout universities, and it set off explosions everywhere, as we knew it would. And finally, what your speech is from our conference on Vladimir Vernadsky, how the real science of ecology is the complete opposite of what the greenies present. But what this DVD does, it destroys, it demolishes the core idea that I would imagine is held by virtually everybody. And it's the idea of the balance of nature, which is that there's an underlying balance to the way nature works, organised into these nice little closed ecosystems, and it's all in balance. And human beings come along, those bastards, and they upset that balance. Now, that's why the Murray-Darling Basin is being defined as a large ecosystem in this, and the plan, the Murray-Darling Basin plan, is to rebalance by getting rid of the human element out of that.
And this is where the second law of thermodynamics comes in, because the second law completely relates to the idea of heat-powered machinery in the sense of how it's applied. So what you see in this DVD is this insanity of how all of nature is equated to, first of all, machines, and then secondly, computers. I mean, I was just about pulling my hair out, Robbie, when I was watching this, because this is so nuts. This fight over ecosystems in terms of the development of these ideas is so pathologically crazy. People will literally say, my God, have I really believed this stuff?
Well, that's a good point, because when people think of the balance of nature, they, in the back of their mind, they assume it comes from this sort of like ancient instinctive understanding humans have developed for thousands of years. Whereas in fact, it comes from an idea cooked up less than a century ago that said something that if people thought about it, most people would instantly reject, that a flower is a machine, a tree is a machine, a duck is a machine.
This goes back to Arthur Tansley's work, doesn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, he actually equated the human mind, for example, as a machine.
Because of course the second law of thermodynamics applied to machine is right. If a machine runs out of fuel, it will stop.
It's a closed system.
That's right. That's right. Nature, as we've shown in our publications, doesn't work that way. And the history of the world over geological time has been one where nature has had this dynamic development to more power, more quantity of it.
More diversity.
More diversity in a way that's the opposite of the entropy, the word entropy, which means winding down, of thermodynamic systems. It's the total opposite. Yet these guys have come along and they've imposed on this. Now, so we're running out of time, but the point is they've imposed on it for a political reason. By getting people to accept the balance of nature, the subplot that people accepted without thinking about it becomes an axiom that, oh yeah, if there's a balance of nature, yeah, we are upsetting it.
So this will be out on our website very, very shortly.
We will be releasing this week on our website in massive quantities. Order it from the CEC, start getting it around. We are going to turn this country on its head with the way it's been brainwashed on this subject. So anyway, that's it for this week's CEC Report. Thanks for tuning in. We'll tune in next week.